The data suggests that we did have strong disinflation, but as of last year, that trend now remains increasingly uncertain, with many of these key metrics moving to the sideways, and more recently, we've seen an acceleration.
Right.
With the PPI, the CPI accelerating for the past 3-4 months, some of these underlying key metrics more than double the Fed's intended target. That doesn't give me or Fed officials much confidence that we're going to reinstate that disinflationary trend.
I saw auto insurance up 11%. You're in the wheelhouse of this in the Midwest. There's a cottage industry, Dallas, Chicago, Cleveland, of taking the 78 things or whatever that make up inflation. I want to pick out this, I want to pick out that, I want to pick out this other thing as well. Paul and my viewers and listeners hate that because they're paying the bills.
Correct.
What are people feeling away from the contrived CPI series?
Well, if we look at this morning's retail sales numbers, we know exactly how consumers are feeling. Even if we parse out some of the weather effects or some of the effects from the fires that we saw in the recent times, what we're seeing is consumers responding to the ongoing burden of elevated prices, and that's forcing somewhat of a pullback in expenditures. Now, again, this isn't an end-all. We have seen consumers spending at a relatively resilient, relatively robust pace, to be honest, for the past several months. But that burden of higher prices is forcing a slowdown in the pace of consumption for consumers, and that's going to be a big challenge for top-line GDP, as we know the consumer is the backbone to the economy.
So if I'm the Federal Reserve, do I stick with you could argue this data suggests that maybe they should, in fact, be thinking about cutting rates, and maybe that whole discussion of maybe lifting rates, that's completely off the table. How do you think the Fed is going to interpret this retail sales data?
I think the Fed is looking at the data coupled with the hotter than expected reads on CPI and PPI, saying we need to be firmly positioned on the sideline to allow the data to further evolve, give us time to assess the data and assess the impact of the incoming fiscal policies that are coming down the pipeline. So the Fed wants to take its time, be patient, and as Chair Powell has said, they are in no rush to move policy at this point. Remember, they've already made a series of policy mistakes along the way. They were late to the inflation taming party on the front end. They didn't raise rates high enough on the back end. Now what we're stuck with is stubbornly elevated inflation and rising fears of potentially emerging weakness on the consumer side or in the labor market.